What's up, guys? Welcome back to Tristan Talks. I know you guys can tell a new scenery. I decided to take it outside and actually touch some grass today. So we're outside right at the side of the library because right after this video I'm going to do some studying for my finals. But I just wanted to get up here and talk about what just happened in the Supreme Court. This is me just thinking about what I know. And so I'm just going to give you a little background. So today, not too long ago, I don't even think, the Supreme Court handed down a ruling that, depending on who you ask, of course, is either a win for colorblind constitutionalism or the latest chapter in a very old story about who actually gets to vote in this country. They voted 6-3, and the VAR, the Voting Rights Act, was its most enforceable provision, was gutted. Louisiana's second majority black congressional district gone, and Justice Alito writes that majority writes the majority, right? She wrote the majority, and Sotomayor dissents and says the ruling. I'm really paraphrasing here, but it basically is green lights maps that shut minority communities out. I mean, we've seen this before, though, okay? And that's what I'm going to get into. And the take I keep seeing online is that this is about racism. Well, yes, it is about racism, but at the same time, I think if we stop at racism, we're missing something bigger. Something that goes deeper than one Supreme Court ruling, deeper than one political party, deeper than this one decade, because this is what I actually want to talk about today. American democracy doesn't move in a straight line. It pulses, it expands, sometimes dramatically, right? And then it contracts. And it has done that over and over and over again in a pattern so consistent that once you see it, you really can't unsee it. So today's ruling really isn't an aberration. It's the contraction phase. If we want to fight it, and we have to understand what we're actually fighting. But most of us are taught that American history is a linear process, as a progress story, or things start bad and then things get good, like with examples like slavery, exclusion, limited suffrage, then slowly, painfully we get better. The 13th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, Brown v. Board, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the arc of a moral universe bending towards justice. And I'm not here to really throw out that framing entirely. Progress happened and real hard-won, life-changing process happened. But that's not what actually the historical record looks like up close. Up close, it looks more like expansion, contraction, expansion, contraction. In 1865, the Civil War ends, right? From the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments get passed. Black men vote. Black men hold office. There are black senators, black congressmen, a genuine functioning multiracial democracy in the South. For the first time in American history, by 1900, almost every single one of these black voters is gone from the rolls. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, white primaries. The Supreme Court signs off on all of it with Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. So what happened? No, this stuff, it was real. When we talk about the expansion happened, of course, but the political will to maintain it ran out. The pressure that created in the moral and political crisis of the Civil War exhausted itself. And when it did, the machinery of democracy got turned around against democracy's own promise. Now fast forward to 1954 and 1965, Brown v. Board and the Civil Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act, and another, which is another, these things are another expansion of democracy. Federal power intervening against structural inclusion because mass mobilization made the cost of not acting too high. With Birmingham, Selma, the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I think I said that right. Let me lock in. And then slowly, once again, contraction happened. In 1974, Milken v. Bradley blocked school desegregation across district lines. In 2013, Shelby County v. Holder guts the VRA's Voting Rights Act pre-clearance requirement. The part that required states with histories of discrimination to get federal approval before changing their voting laws in 2021. But in 2021, you had Abramovich v. the DNC versus the DNC, which weakened what's left of Section 2. And today, this ruling that just happened today finishes that job. It's the same cycle, but it's a different century. Guys, lock in. Because I just don't want people to stop at this is racist. Because it is racist, but there's more stuff you need to think about and how we can combat it. When you call it racist, you just put it aside. You call everything else racist. People call everything racist. So what does it mean if you call this ruling racist? I'm just opening your eyes. But why does contraction always come? When I was researching this, and I've been researching a lot of things, but I've been researching because I recently read How Democracies Die in my history class, and I was researching about people kept saying that it was the people who voted for them, or it's just the president's fault. No, it's not no one's fault. It's just the structural implications that have been set in this democracy that make you feel this way. There is a contraction happen. I mean, you pass the amendments. They pass the amendments. You win the war. You pass the amendments. You pass the laws. Why can't this stuff hold? There's a few things that's going on here, and they all operate at the same time. There's a thing called Thermidor effect. I think I said that right. After the French Revolution, historians named the inevitable reactionary phase that follows radical change. Thermidor says that the idea is dramatic transformation destabilized power, and destabilized power fights back. Every expansion in America, American democracy has had this effect. The question isn't whether the backlash comes, it's whether the democratic infrastructure built during the expansion is strong enough to survive it. Right now, we're finding out the VRA wasn't strong enough. Not because the law was bad, it was transformative, but because the political will to protect it and enforce it didn't outlast the mobilization that created it. Democratic expansions in America have always required cross-racial coalitions. And these coalitions are inherently fragile because the white members of the coalition have historically had off-ramps that black members don't. Du Bois calls this the psychological wage of whiteness. Poor white workers in the post-Civil War South didn't get much materially from their racial hierarchy, but they got status. They got the psychological comfort of not being at the bottom. And that was often enough to make them choose racial solidarity over class solidarity when the pressure dropped. Reconstruction doesn't just get dismantled from above by Southern planters. It got dismantled because Northern politicians and Northern voters decided that sectional reconciliation was more important than black rights. That coalition broke when that happened. And when the coalition breaks, the expansion can't hold. It doesn't hold. But today's version of that is more complicated because the structure is the same. The question of who gets to stay in a coalition or on what terms is always the fault line. And then you have the time delay problem. The Supreme Court operates on a 20 to 30 year lag from public opinion because justice serves for life, right? The 6-3 conservative supermajority we're dealing with right now is the products of the decisions made in 2016 and 2020. Today's ruling isn't about 2026, it's about 2016. The contraction is always partly a time delay mechanism. You lose an election, you lose a Supreme Court seat, and you feel it a decade later. That's not conspiracy, it's institutional design, right? My allergies be getting me, so my fault if I sniffle. But it means the compounding effects of political decisions are always worse than they appear in the moment, right? The contractionary phases in American history haven't always been coups. They've been democratic in form. At least, citizens voted for these politicians who appointed judges who dismantled structural protections. The machinery of democracy was used against democracy's own promise. The disenfranchisement of black voters after Reconstruction wasn't just imposed by elites, it was popular. The massive resistance to desegregation wasn't just Southern governors, it was PTAs, it was school boards, neighborhood associations, ordinary people choosing hierarchy over inclusion. Hannah Arendt argued that that political evil at scale requires mass participation to function. You can extend that logic here. Democratic erosion doesn't just happen to people. Sometimes people choose it. Sometimes the contraction is what the majority wants. And that's probably, I know that just hurts y'all a little bit, but that's the truth. Well, at least I think it's true. But I want to get to a point. But is this neoliberalism? The short answer is yes, but not in the most obvious way. When people say neoliberalism, they usually mean free markets or deregulation or the Reagan false revolution, or globalization. And that's part of it, of course, but neoliberalism as an ideology is about how the state relates to inequality. And the answer is it retreats from structural remedies and reframes everything as neutral, procedural, and individual. That's exactly what today's majority opinion does. It uses the Equal Protection Clause as a Reconstruction era amendment written specifically to protect Black Americans from state-sponsored discrimination as a weapon against race-conscious remedies for that same discrimination. The recognition of race becomes the problem. The history of racial exclusion is treated as resolved or irrelevant or both. That is the colorblind ideology in its legal form. And colorblind ideology is neoliberalism's answer to racism. Don't fix the structural conditions, just stop naming the race. I think something's biting me. No, I'm good. The Shelby County decision in 2013, the one that gutted the VRA pre-clearance, was explicit about this logic. The court said that the South had changed. Disparities in voters' registration had been erased. African Americans were attaining political office in record numbers. The act had done its work. It was time to move on. The problem is that the argument treats the law as a cause of equality rather than the condition for it. The moment you remove the enforcement mechanism, the baseline it created starts to erode, which is exactly what happened. Immediately after Shelby County, states passed new restrictive voting laws within months, some within hours. Y'all, we gotta lock in with me. So yes, today's ruling lives inside a neoliberal legal framework. It assumes that formal equality is sufficient, that the state should be in the business of engineering racial outcomes, that individual rights trumps structural remedies. It's an ideology as much as a legal argument, and it has its consequences. And the last part I want to leave you guys with is, what do we do? I mean, you hear this stuff, and they blame it on racism, and they don't do anything. So I'm going to give you some tips and tricks on what would we do. Sorry. So, as of right now, as I said before, we're in a contraction phase. We understand why, and we understand the ideology behind it. I want to be honest here, because I think this section is where a lot of videos lose me. The call to action part that's actually just a list of vague imperatives. Stay informed, vote, organize, keep fighting. That's not a strategy, that's a mood. Let me say something specific here, or try to say something specific. First, you have to understand what has actually worked. Every expansion phase in American democracy was preceded by a period when the legal and institutional routes were already closed. The VRA didn't pass because civil rights lawyers argue eloquently in court. It passed because Bull Connor put children on national television getting hit with fire hoses, and the moral cost of inaction became unbearable. The lesson isn't that the law doesn't matter, it's that the law follows pressure, not the other way around. Institutions respond to organized people, making the status quo more expensive than change. This has been true every single time. Secondly, you have to think locally, not just nationally. The reason the contraction is happening at the federal level is partly because one political coalition spent 40 years building state-level power, while the others chased presidential elections. State legislators drew congressional maps. State attorney generals bring or don't bring civil rights cases. State courts interpret voting right laws. The ground game is local. That means school boards, county commissioners, state legislative races that nobody covers, and the 3,000 people decide. The compounding effects of local power are enormous, and the organizing investment required is much lower than a Senate race. Thirdly, Is thirdly a word? I hope so. You play the long legal game. You have to. Well, you don't really have to, but that's my opinion. You play the long legal game. The NAACP's legal campaign against Plessy v. Ferguson took 58 years. Charles Hamilton Houston, Thurgood Marshall's mentor, spent his career building a doctrine across dozens of small cases that made Brown v. Board legally inevitable in 1954. He died 4 years before the decision. The response to today's ruling has to include the same kind of thinking. What cases do we build now, and in what sequence to lay the foundation for the next expansion phase? Organizations like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Brennan Center, the Democratic Democracy Docket are already doing this. I'm not editing that out. I make mistakes too. The works deserve attention, resources, and public understanding, not just in moments in crisis. Fourth is to build power that doesn't depend on federal protection. If the VRA can't protect majority-minority districts, the answer is to partly build political power that doesn't require majority-minority districts to be competitive. Voting registration infrastructure, ranked choice voting advocacy, independent redistricting, commissions at the state level. These are slower and less satisfying than a Supreme Court ruling, but they're harder to dismantle from the top. You have to do the cultural work. Ida B. Wells didn't end lynching by filing lawsuits. She documented it obsessively, published it, and forced it into a national and international consciousness, and made the reputational and economic cost to the South impossible to ignore. The exposure strategy, making visible what power wants to keep invisible, is consistently underrated. This is what journalists, storytellers, content creators, scholars are for. The legal battles matter. The electoral battles matter as well. But the battle over how people understand what's happening, what story they're living inside, that matters too. Maybe more than anything else. But Frederick Douglass said in 1857, and it hasn't stopped being true, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, it never will. The contraction phase ends when the cost of maintaining exceeds the cost of reversing it. The cost is set by organized people with a long-term horizon, not by good arguments alone. Not by moral clarity, by sustained, coordinated pressure that doesn't exhaust itself between election cycles. The fact that we're in a contractions phase is not evidence that the expansions were fake, or that people who fought for them were naive. The Civil Rights Movement was real. The Voting Rights Act changed lives. The gains were real. The cycle tells us that progress is reversible. But it also tells us that reversal is reversible. The reversible is reversible. The contraction after Reconstruction didn't end the story. It took 90 years, but the story continued. The next expansion came. It was hard and partial and cost enormous suffering, but it came. Our job right now in this moment is to shorten that 90 years, to build infrastructure resilient enough that the next contraction can't go as deep, to organize, litigate, create documents, and vote in ways that make the cost of exclusion higher than the cost of inclusion. That's not idealism, that's pattern recognition. We've been here before. We know what the cycle looks like. Now we decide what we do with that knowledge. Anyways, I'll put my sources and research notes in the bio. I appreciate y'all listening. Peace.